intersect to form rich social contexts for perceiving others. And the importance of social categories, like, absolutely cannot be understated, because it's kind of our very first impression of a person, and that's kind of the starting point from which we make important subsequent judgments that are very relevant to the human condition, friendship, finding a mate, deciding which social group that we belong to, things like that. But the complexity of this has kind of been underestimated in previous research. Previous research has placed this importance on dominating social categories. They say that, for example, when you're perceiving a black man, that at any given moment, our brains in working memory are only processing the fact that he's black or the fact that that person is a man. And not only is one category dominant, but other categories are actively and completely inhibited. So when we're having a social interaction with a black male, we are absolutely, like, by this model, we are only able to think about this person as a black person or as a male. And the kind of justification for this is a cognitive efficiency model that our brains need to streamline this kind of massive amount of social visual stimulus and just kind of make it easier to work with. But it should be kind of obvious and intuitive that this is not how we process social others, that instead multiple social categories are simultaneously and partially active. And even though there may be some situations in interracial context, for example, when one of them is particularly salient or predominant, all other social categories are still remaining partially active in our brains. And how we studied this was by making use of a pretty new behavioral way of looking at things, by tracking motor output and having that reflect real-time cognitive dynamics in decision-making and categorization. In this particular animation, for example, that's like an atypical kind of feminized male face. And by looking at the mouse pattern when they're deciding that that person's male, there's kind of a graded attraction towards the female category, which shows that at any given moment, even though one category is obvious and clear, that when we're, like, making decisions in real time, that other categories can still attract us. So what we did was we created a mouse tracking task, and this is what the computer screen would look like. And there would be a face on one side, and they would get a verbal cue to say drag to the correct sex, and this is just an example. Some trials would ask them to drag the correct race. But in every trial, the relevant social category that they were asked to drag the face to was horizontally opposite. And in certain trials, there would be an irrelevant distractor at the top, such that the only social category that the face belongs to is horizontally opposite, and the social categories at the top and bottom are absolutely irrelevant. And by our theory, since this is the only social category that that person belongs to, that when you track the mouse movements, there should just be a straight line from the face to the correct sex. And this is an example of a trial, so that's what we found. But in these critical trials, where there would be a relevant social category at the top, because that's a white male face, what we expected to find, based by the prior research on mouse tracking and our hypothesis, was that even though they were asked to drag to the correct sex, the fact that that is a white person would attract them to that social category at the top. So there was going to be this graded curve during the real-time decision-making process. And this is an example of a trial in one of these critical trials. So there's an obvious graded attraction to the white category, even though they were asked to select the correct sex. And this is an example, as I said before, by the original model of social categorization, you would just like expect straight lines in all trials because you're asked to direct the correct sex. Sex is the dominant social category, just boom, it goes straight there. But since there's like parallel and partial activation of two social categories, you just kind of get this graded attraction. And although sex is the predominant category, there's still activation of other social categories that the face belongs to. And here's an average across all the trials. The black dotted line represents trials in which there was only one relevant social category, sex or race, on the opposite side. And then the white dotted line represents when there was a relevant social category at the top. So you kind of see, averaged across all trials, that kind of graded attraction towards the other relevant social category. And statistically speaking, this bar graph, I guess my y-axis didn't show up, but this bar graph represents the maximum deviation from essentially the original model because it represents the deviation from just a straight line across. And as you can see in trials where there were two relevant categories, you got a much larger deviation with kind of that graded curve as I showed you earlier. And it's a statistically significant difference from when there was just one relevant category where you know, people are making these decisions in real time, so they still might waffle, but there's a statistical significance in the trials with two relevant categories. And so this pretty clearly reflects our hypothesis that all apparent social categories are simultaneously and partially active. And kind of the main take-home message of this is that by the original cognitive model of social categorization, there's just kind of this like discrete streamlined social context during social interactions where when you're looking at, say, an Asian woman, there's just like a choice of social contexts, whether it's the context of her being Asian or the context of her being a woman. But one of the biggest implications of this is that during social interactions, sex is an active context for race, and race is an active context for sex. So instead of sex and race just kind of dominating social interactions, each of them kind of contextualize and form this dynamic picture of social others. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of like implications for different philosophical and social movements. This kind of reflects a new movement in social psychology, sociology, to make like experimental findings about social interaction more relatable to what we actually experience in the real world. Because when we are experiencing others in the real world, we aren't, say, categorizing them experimentally based on one social category. We're experiencing all of their dynamic qualities and using them to make inferences and, you know, like cognitive formations of other people. And another kind of interesting movement that this is relevant to is there's a term coined by the third wave feminist movement called intersectionality, which is kind of a criticism of the 50s and 60s civil rights movement for women. And it basically says that social roles and human importance in society isn't strictly defined by like one discrete social group. So obviously, if multiple social groups intersect and interact to form socially complex beings, then that kind of supports that. But more than anything, although this particular research supports those particular movements, it's kind of more of this kind of growing of a fostering discussion about what different social categories mean, what social roles may imply, and basically it has applicability to sociology, psychology, law, and it has a lot of importance for understanding how we relate and how we communicate with other people. So, yeah.